Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have with us Adam Kingl. He is an author, an educator, and we'll learn from him why leaders are losing young talent, how to recruit, retain, and manage top young talent in a multi generational workplace, how to build human centric organizations that inspire loyalty, and why adaptability, creativity, and innovation are essential management skills. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thanks very much for having me.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form, Adam. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe. A lot of leaders across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about how one can retain and recruit young top talent and much more. We'll talk about all this, but before that, let's talk a bit about your journey, your background, so that the audience knows who they are listening to.
Yeah, very happy to. I'm an author, keynote speaker, academic, and a researcher. I've been in this business for about 20 years, and I'm affiliated with a number of business schools, both in the UK and in Europe. As your listeners might be able to tell from my accent, I'm originally from the US, but lived half of my life in the UK. That's the current half. So I live just outside London. What we're going to be talking about is the subject of my first book, which is titled Next Generation Leadership. I've written two books since then, but this book really has had a very long tail, and that's because the need to win the talent war, and particularly how to attract and retain top young talent, is a core need and opportunity for businesses. We know, organizations say their talent is their top resource, but they aren't particularly good about curating and keeping it, typically. And so way back in 2009, I started researching by interviewing and surveying top young talent. So not just random young people, but really the people that companies wanted to recruit, the high potentials. And I was directing a program at the time called Emerging Leaders at London Business School. So I had this sort of great resource at my disposal, these global top leaders. And so I interviewed them and their bosses and their HR directors when I could over about 3 years. And ultimately that led to writing the book, sharing all of that original research. So that's how we got to this point.
Absolutely, Adam. Absolutely. So, to understand it for the audience, how should we understand? Is it that the organizations have not been able to keep pace, or leaders have not been able to keep pace with the young generation? Or is it that young generation is not fit for the, in a way, not fit for the workplace of today or maybe perhaps yesterday?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I might perhaps just go back to giving a definition, because I think it's useful context. I think it's best to define a generation as a group that has all had a similar context in which they grew up. So they were surrounded by similar paradigms and also had similar paradigms in when they first entered work. Those early, rich, different experiences affect how they think about work, careers, life, leadership. So given that, if we understand the world in which people in their 20s, 30s entered work, it helps us to start to understand that they experience high volatility, high disloyalty among their employers in terms of how they kept talent or removed talent during like the Great Recession, during the cost of living crisis, during COVID. And so all of this tells us that what organizations are experiencing is a response to their world of work, which has showed disloyalty to them. So we shouldn't then look back as employers and think, oh, this generation, they're so disloyal. Actually, they're simply responding to the environment that we created. And so we have to think about if we are creating the right response and environment that gives people a both logical and emotional reason to give their discretionary effort and their time to us and to keep it with us.
Absolutely, Adam. Absolutely. So, are there any statistics to show that the workplaces were either taken for by surprise by the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, or were they, or some organizations were really ready for the next generation? How would you look back and understand things as it unfolded, especially during, Great Resignation?
Well, during the Great Resignation in particular, I think almost every organization was highly unprepared for that event, and that's because they were still applying the paradigms and thinking of 20 years before. That if all you have to do is say, well, we have this great package for you, and we have a promotion kind of ladder, and that is sufficient. But actually, when I surveyed high potentials and asked them what are the top 3 things you're looking for from an employer, all 3 things that they shared, the top 3 things that they shared on average, were not material things. And this represents a sea change for how organizations need to sculpt and communicate their employer value proposition. Now, when I say immaterial things, I don't mean unimportant things, but it is not the criteria that companies applied and too often still apply today in terms of what would be most important for attracting top young talent. And those top 3 things are development opportunities, culture, and work-life balance. The interesting thing about all of those things is that they are often inexpensive or free for organizations. And yet for too long, we've taken our eye off the ball about how we make these things manifest and consistent in our organizations so that our employees both see them happening, see the advantages of them happening, and see that there is no gap between how we talk about those things and how they show up in the workplace.
Absolutely, Adam. So, on the face of it, if you see, when you talk of development opportunities, weren't they there also in, all along? Internally, people had the growth opportunities. They could apply for jobs which were available within the organization. Even in government sector, it was there. Even in terms of culture, some organizations that we talk about, all those fan companies and all these are very, at least 20 years plus companies. They do have the culture. They are still having a great say in the present economics of things, everywhere. If you look at all these companies, and then you talk about the work-life balance, and some of these companies were providing people earlier on. People used to say we had a better quality of life. When did they start losing the plot? Actually, was it only a few years back, or was it started happening long back?
This has been happening since the early noughties, at least. So I would suggest since the new millennium. And let's take those one by one. Let's talk about development. Often when organizations talk about development, they mean expensive courses. And so it's only available for a small % of their people. But that's not what young hypo talent meant when I asked them, what do you mean when you say development? And also a big mistake that companies make is they offer development only as a reward for tenure, and it's very episodic. In other words, they'll say, after you've worked here for 5 years, then we'll give you some development. Or once you reach this level in the organization, then we'll give you some development, etc. But development needs to happen sort of all the time. So how do we do that? Well, we do it through things that we incorporated into the activities of daily life. Mentoring, coaching, shadowing, secondments. Most of these things are things we can do every day, but we don't. And even projects. Of course, we know 60 to 70% of the world's work is organized in projects. And yet we do a very poor job about explaining to our people when we assign them a project how it's going to develop them in certain areas. That alone makes explicit that they're developing by working here, even doing the day job. But that requires curiosity. We have to understand what areas of development are useful, important, helpful for that top talent. Now, if we look at culture, there's often a huge gap between the culture organizations claim that they have and the culture that employees actually experience. So the best definition of culture I've ever heard, which is so elegant because it's simple, short, and true, is this: shared behaviors. That's it. Shared behaviors. What that implies is that every team leader in the organization has to take personal accountability for making sure that the way we relate to one another is idiosyncratic, unique, and adds value to our organization. And when they don't do that, even if it happens in one team and not in others, we experience that, we see that, and people leave. I mean, we know the cliche that we say people they don't leave their company, they leave their manager. That's partly true or wholly true if we assume that that means people are leaving their manager because the manager wasn't adequately engineering the behaviors that were required in that organization. So culture is more micro in how it's experienced. It's not company-wide. My culture is how I relate to the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people that I deal with every day in my company. That's my culture. Doesn't matter what HR does or says, doesn't matter what head office does or says. The culture is in my immediate colleagues, in my immediate team. So leaders have an overweighted responsibility to be stewards of their culture. And then finally, work-life balance. The big issue that I experienced when I talk about work-life balance, when I started doing research, is this: there is semantic discord in the workforce about what work-life balance even means. So often when I ask younger people, what do you mean when you say work-life balance? They often talk about place, where work happens. They want flexibility with that. When I ask older generations, what do you mean when we say work-life balance? They often talk about hours worked. In other words, to say work-life balance means to work less. What this tells us is that often the emotion that is charged around the conversation work-life balance is often a semantic one. We aren't talking about the same thing. So the best piece of advice I can give listeners about work-life balance is, if you're having that conversation in the workplace, before you get into the nuts and bolts of it, the very first question you should ask is, what do you mean when you say work-life balance to the other party? And then that way, at least you'll make sure that you're talking about the same context, which has not been happening enough in the workforce. If we conflate what work-life balance means for us, assume that's what it means for everyone else, we're setting us up for disaster. And that's a big reason why people are leaving their organizations. They don't feel heard.
Absolutely. So, Adam, one thing I want to understand from you, from your experience and research, is that in the last 10 years at least, or more than that, there have been a huge growth in the number of startups all across the world, almost every country. And this were by young people. Do you think they also miss the bus in understanding the requirements of the new generation, in spite of many of them being young themselves? Or was it the challenge of investor money? How would you want to look at that opportunity?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons we see people pursuing startups, and it's absolutely right that more and more people are envisioning their career, their aspiration is for their career to go through the startup route. And I think that because people feel they have agency over their career and their lives. B, they see these enormously public success stories, right, of people becoming millionaires, billionaires as startup founders. Of course, what you don't see publicly is the graveyard of the startups that never reached escape velocity. But of course, there's easier access to funding than ever before. It's more publicly available. It's easier to reach and communicate with those parties. That also makes the startup life more attractive for people to at least have a go at it. But also, people don't necessarily see a career as tied to an employer. People are more defining careers as having rich experiences in which they grow, sure, create wealth, but also do exciting things. And often, I think there's a perception that if I try to do that with a company, depending on the company, of course, that can often hold me back from pursuing exciting, fun developments, for developing my career in exactly the way I would wish, in making my choices, et cetera, et cetera. So, we know on MBA programs around the world, for example, even going back 25 years ago, most people pursued finance and consulting careers post MBA. Today, what most MBAs in business schools aspire to is to found a company or to work in a startup. So that's a sea change in and of itself. And that alone tells us that corporations, particularly large corporations, have a bigger challenge facing them in terms of how to attract talent, because the competitive set is no longer a company's competitor in their industry, but it's convincing young high potential talent that the corporate life is better, or at least as good and valuable and rewarding as the startup life.
Absolutely, Adam. Absolutely. So, is the industry, are the leaders now ready to embrace the new young generation? Are they ready to meet them where they are, or they think that now AI has come in, a lot of tasks they can get done through AI, and they would need to compromise only with a few less number of these young talent?
Well, I've certainly been, banging the drum on how to attract and keep top young talent for a long time now, for 15 years. And some companies are starting to hear the message and are reacting accordingly, and many are not still. And that's worrisome. And AI is as probably at the moment making that worse. As you say, organizations saying, well, I don't have to attract or keep top young talent. I'll just have AI do it. AI is compliant. AI costs less. Not at first, of course, you have the fixed cost of it, but over time. What those companies are missing, however, is what do you do then in terms of the skills that you also will need humans to do? For example, relating to your customers, demonstrating empathy, new product and business model innovation. Sure, doing the minutiae of mechanical activities and rudimentary analysis, sure, that can be done by AI. But historically, what's happened is we've asked young graduates to do that work. So, and as they develop those skills, they're also acquiring adaptive human skills, which they use and leverage in a greater ratio the more senior they become. But the problem is, if you're not hiring those graduates in the first case, then who's going to be doing the human-driven adaptive skills that you need at mid-career? Because at some point, then you're really going to have a talent gap, because you've never been teaching people directly and indirectly, consciously and unconsciously, those skills that AI will not be able to execute or replicate as people progress through their careers. So, and some companies are picking up on this. I'm noting that there are a couple of technology companies and professional services companies that really repress their hiring of graduates. And then this very argument I've been making has dawned on them. And now all of a sudden they're trying to do these massive recruitment, because they know that even if AI can do many of the things they'll be asking of young talent today, they will need that young talent to develop through the ranks and learn how we execute our strategy here, so that then, when they're 5 years into the company, 10 years into the company, they will be ready to do those things. If they wait, then they're cutting off the blood supply of their skills pipeline, and that's really going to hurt them 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Absolutely, Adam. Absolutely. Let me understand it this way. Right now, everyone is talking about, agentic AI agents, agentic AI, and all that stuff. And now, especially, with this AI, several of these companies, AI companies, they are coming with all, $1 trillion IPOs and all these things. So there will be a lot of talk, a lot of noise also around all these things. And perhaps many leaders will think, okay, this is going to solve my problem. When do you think, or when do you see all this settling down in terms of future of work, future of management, future of employment or employability, and things actually, become better? Before this, how do you see a lot of bloodbath going forward?
I see lots of volatility, chaos, over the next 10 years. It reminds me very much of hearing, obviously I've worked a lot in higher education, but my clients, my corporate clients, when I do executive education, come from every sector that you can think of. And this moment in AI's evolution and implementation reminds me very much of the same conversation that was happening around companies asking business schools, for example, for help to digitalize in, say, 2009, 2010, 2011. And it took about 10 years for that conversation to die down, for that all kind of to settle in, to use the vocabulary that you said. So I suspect that AI will take at least as long, possibly longer, because I think AI's capability itself is evolving and adapting faster than simple digitalization. But I would say, I suspect / predict that we might see an equilibrium starting to occur in about 10 years' time. So I think at the moment it feels very wild, wild west, doesn't it? But that evolution from chaos to equilibrium occurs over time. And also, of course, it doesn't mean chaos for 10 years and then all of a sudden you're reaching equilibrium. It will feel less and less chaotic with every passing year. And then I think finally we'll get to a settling in moment, I suspect, in about a decade.
Absolutely, absolutely. Be whatever the level of chaos, 10 years still a good amount of time for everyone, either for the industry, for the leaders, even for the young talent. So in a nutshell, what would you like to tell these people, leaders, organizations, as well as the young talent, to be future ready in all aspects?
Well, certainly you need talent, right? And you can't just rely on talent who are, 40 years old plus. We always need to cultivate and attract a talent pipeline. So all of this stuff is ever more relevant, particularly amidst volatility and transformation in our respective industries. So I hope that organizations will start to listen even more, lean into the needs, the desires that they're hearing, particularly from young talent, so that they can meet their moment and attract, engage, and retain their future leaders to make themselves future-proof, so that they will be able to seize the opportunities in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. If they don't do so, I think they will find that they will become obsolescent. They won't have the people, the talent, the skills to be ready for the newest opportunities, the newest challenges that we face, say in the 2030s, 2040s. So I hope that organizations, despite AI, despite robotics, you name it, will start to consider, how do we also help make our work life more livable for the human beings that are a part of that ecosystem? And in so doing, we'll start to build a stronger foundation, not just for our survivability, but for our competitiveness and our ability to thrive going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Adam, there is so much to learn about all this from you, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, perhaps be your client. What's the best way for them to do so?
Just find me on my website, which is just my name, adamkingl.com, and that's spelled ADAMKINGL.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.